You ran that red light. License and registration.
Officer, we're an ALS ambulance on an active trauma response. We clear the intersection per protocol. Please, this call is time.
I'm not debating. Give me your info.
We are in a rush because someone could die if we're delayed.
Don't interfere with my stop.
Post-industrial.
This was one of those situations that started off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part, if one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Before we get into it, drop where you're watching from in the comments. And if you pay attention to stories about power, accountability, and moments where the system slips, hit like and subscribe, because this entire story turns on minutes that never came back. This happened in Clearwater, Florida, on Gulf to Bay Boulevard near Belcher Road. Medic 12 sat on the shoulder with its emergency lights still flashing, painting the pavement red and blue. The siren wasn't fully blasting anymore, but it hadn't gone silent either. It let out that muted, restless whine ambulances make when they're supposed to be moving and aren't. Maya Chen was in the driver's seat. She was the lead paramedic on shift, and the one responsible for getting them to the scene. Her hands were steady on the wheel, posture forward, eyes fixed ahead like she was ready to pull out at any second. Andre Ruiz sat in the passenger seat. The dispatch tablet was already open in his lap, the active trauma call glowing on the screen. He also had the printed run sheet in his hand. Timestamp, unit assignment, priority level, everything clearly documented. They weren't heading back to station. They weren't clearing a call. They were supposed to be first on scene. Minutes earlier, dispatch had sent them to a multi-vehicle crash with possible entrapment and 2 critical patients. Fire units were still en route. Medic 12 was the closest advanced life support unit available. That was why they were running lights and sirens. That was why time mattered. They had approached an intersection, slowed, cleared it, and proceeded through a red light exactly as protocol allowed. That was when the cruiser lit up behind them. At first, neither of them believed it. Emergency vehicles don't get stopped in the middle of active trauma responses, not like this. But when the loudspeaker came on ordering the ambulance to pull over, Maya made a split-second decision that would later be questioned from every angle. If she ignored the order, the situation could escalate. If it escalated, they'd lose even more time. So she pulled over. Officer Kyle Mercer stepped out of his patrol car like this was a standard traffic stop. 11 months on the job. Solo patrol. Still close enough to the academy that rules mattered more to him than context. He approached the driver's window already set on enforcement. He focused on the red light and ignored the emergency lights still flashing behind him. He demanded license and registration, as if this were a private vehicle and not a fully marked ambulance on an active call. Andre made sure the tablet stayed visible. He held the run sheet up where it could be seen. Everything needed to verify. The emergency was right there. Mercer barely looked at it. From his posture and pacing, it was clear he'd already decided the stop was about control. He didn't ask dispatch to verify. He didn't call a supervisor. He treated the moment like a challenge to his authority, instead of a medical emergency unfolding somewhere else. Maya stayed calm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She followed protocol and radioed dispatch, reporting that they were being held on a traffic stop while responding to an active trauma call and requesting police supervision. Dispatch confirmed what was already true. The call was active. Medic 12 was still primary. They began trying to reach police command. But cross-channel communication is slow when seconds matter. While radios crackled and calls stacked up, Mercer ran IDs. Everything came back clean. No flags, no issues, no reason to continue the stop. And yet, he didn't release them. Instead, he started writing a citation. This was the moment where time stopped being theoretical. Every second the pen moved across that paper was another second without advanced care at the crash scene. Andre understood it immediately. He tried to de-escalate, suggesting the officer follow them and handle any issue later. Mercer shut that down and warned him not to interfere. 14 minutes passed, before a supervisor finally intervened and ordered the ambulance released. By then, the outcome was already sliding into place. Maya pulled back onto Gulf to Bay hard, lights blazing, sirens screaming again. The crash scene was only 2 minutes away. 2 minutes too late. 2 minutes after being released, Medic 12 hit the crash scene on Gulf to Bay like a sprint that started 14 minutes too late. Fire engines had just arrived. Their lights were already bouncing off twisted metal and scattered glass. The road was a grid of hazards, angled bumpers, steam, debris, and people standing in shock near the shoulder with phones in their hands. Because that's what people do now when something terrible happens in public. Captain Rob Mallory was already in motion, directing his crew towards the worst impact point. He saw the ambulance and his first reaction wasn't relief. It was confusion. Medic 12 was the closest unit. Everybody on that scene knew that. In a response like this, the first ALS rig should have been there early, not arriving behind the first wave of suppression. Mallory met them the second they stepped out. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He demanded to know where they had been. Not because he wanted an argument, because he needed to understand what the scene had already lost. Maya answered in one line, clean and blunt. A traffic stop. That landed wrong at first, the way a sentence sounds when the brain rejects it. Mallory made her repeat it, not because he didn't hear, but because he couldn't accept that it was real. While that exchange happened, Andre was already scanning for patients, doing what experienced medics do when they know the clock has been running without them. He moved fast, but not frantic. Fast enough to be useful, controlled enough to be accurate. There were 2 victims flagged as critical. Lauren Bishop was one of them. Teacher, mom of 2, the kind of name that would later be said carefully on the news. Frank Delgado was the other. Construction supervisor, someone who spent his life on job sites, and would be described later as dependable, the guy who always showed up. Firefighters had done what they could with what they had. They had controlled hazards, established scene safety, started basic interventions. But fire crews weren't ALS. They didn't carry the same meds, the same advanced airway capability, the same cardiac tools. They could hold the line. They couldn't replace the ambulance that was supposed to already be there. Mallory's crew had just finished a quick assessment on one of the victims and relayed what they'd seen. There had been faint signs when they arrived. Not a miracle, not a guarantee. Just enough to make the next few minutes matter. And that was the part nobody could undo. Maya and Andre moved in with the efficiency of people who've done this 1,000 times. No drama, no big gestures, just hands and eyes and protocols firing in sequence. They checked for pulse. They checked breathing. They checked responsiveness. They reassessed, because good medics don't accept the first answer when the stakes are this high. Andre found nothing. Maya confirmed it. No pulse, no signs of life. The kind of confirmation that goes quiet in your head even while everything around you stays loud. And in that moment, the traffic stop stopped being an argument about rules. It became an event with a measurable cost. Because there's a difference between being late and being late when someone still had a chance. Maya didn't collapse. Andre didn't curse. They didn't act out. They did what professionals do when the outcome is already sealed. They documented, they communicated, they moved to the next task because a scene like that doesn't pause for grief. But the scene felt it anyway. Mallory looked at the ambulance like it had arrived from another timeline, one where it should have been there earlier and wasn't. His confusion turned into a cold, focused anger, not at the medics, but at the idea that a patrol stop could override a trauma response. That kind of anger doesn't stay on the roadside, it travels. And by the time the scene wrapped and the units cleared, the most important thing about that night wasn't the wreck itself. It was the 14 minutes that vanished on the shoulder of the road, while a citation was written like time was unlimited. The story didn't explode because people were emotional. It exploded because everything was recorded. Back on Gulf to Bay, after the scene cleared and the chaos settled into paperwork, Maya and Andre did what experienced crews always did after something went wrong in a way that wasn't medical. They documented the timeline like it would be read later by people who weren't there, because they knew it would. The run sheet already had the basics: dispatch timestamp, call type, unit assignment. The tablet had the live call history. Their radio traffic was logged. And behind them, Officer Kyle Mercer's body camera had been running for the entire stop. His voice, his posture, his pacing, his choices. This wasn't going to come down to opinion. It was going to come down to minutes and proof. The first thing that made this different was how clean the verification could have been. Andre had put the dispatch screen in the officer's line of sight. He had physically held a printed run sheet like a receipt for reality. Medic 12 didn't need a debate. They needed one radio call. That call didn't happen. Instead, Mercer turned it into a roadside process. IDs were run, nothing hit. No warrants, no issues. Yet the stop didn't end, because by then it wasn't about confirming an emergency. It was about finishing the ticket. That detail mattered later, because once it was obvious the ambulance was legitimate, every additional second became harder to justify. Dispatch had tried to clean it up from their end. They confirmed emergency status was active. They attempted cross-channel contact with the police department. They escalated the request. But it wasn't a direct line. It never was. It was relays and hold times and someone trying to reach someone else, while the scene on Gulf to Bay kept moving without advanced care. That's how systems fail, without anyone having to raise their voice. Sergeant Dana Holloway got pulled into it the way supervisors always do, late because the system wasn't designed for speed between agencies, only for documentation after the fact. When she finally reached Mercer, the first thing she needed was the reason, not the general concept, the exact reason. Why an emergency vehicle marked as active trauma response was being held on the shoulder. Mercer's justification was simple. He had seen the ambulance go through a red light and decided traffic enforcement still applied. Holloway's response wasn't philosophical. It was operational. Emergency vehicles had protocol. Verification could be done by radio. If there was an issue, it could be addressed after the call, without freezing a trauma response on the roadside. She ordered him to clear the ambulance. That should have been the end of it. But Mercer didn't pivot fast. That was another point the footage later made painfully clear. There was a stall, a finish-the-process hesitation, the kind of delay that feels small to the person holding the pen and enormous to the people staring at a dispatch clock. When the release finally happened, it didn't look like teamwork. It looked like a lecture attached to paperwork. And that became the second thing that made this blow up: the tone. Because in situations like this, departments can sometimes hide behind the fog of confusion, miscommunication, bad radio, unclear status. But Mercer's body cam didn't show confusion. It showed certainty. It showed an officer treating a trauma response like a teachable moment for compliance. Meanwhile, the fire captain's reaction at the scene got documented too, because fire crews record, by report if not by camera. The absence of ALS on arrival was noted. The presence of faint signs earlier was noted. The timeline became a straight line: stop, delay, arrival, outcome. And once the line was drawn, people started asking the same question in different ways. Because in modern America, you don't just have witnesses, you have footage. And by the time the internal conversations began, this wasn't just an incident anymore, it was a record. Once this hit the outside world, it stopped being an internal matter overnight. The reason was simple. There were too many records telling the same story. Dispatch logs showed Medic 12 was primary on an active trauma call. Radio traffic showed Maya requested a PD supervisor while still on that call. Fire reports showed ALS should have arrived earlier and Mercer's body cam captured the rest. An officer treating an emergency ambulance like a routine traffic stop while the clock kept running. By the next morning, reporters weren't chasing rumors. They were chasing a timeline. And the phrase that made people freeze when they heard it, because it sounded too dumb to be real, was the same one Captain Rob Mallory reacted to at the scene: traffic stop. That phrase spread because it explained the one thing everyone kept asking: why the closest ALS unit arrived late. When the department stepped in front of cameras, they didn't have room to soften it. The chief called it indefensible and confirmed the obvious point. The officer knew it was an ambulance with emergency lights active. That killed the easiest excuse. The idea it was confusion, it wasn't. It was a choice. The union's first response tried to hide behind training language, implying the officer was simply enforcing rules and following procedure. But that line collapsed fast because procedure doesn't look like ignoring a dispatch tablet and a printed run sheet, refusing quick radio verification, and continuing the stop after IDs came back clean. And it definitely doesn't look like delaying release even after a supervisor gets involved. Public pressure forced the messaging to shift from defense to distance. Inside internal affairs, the investigation didn't start with feelings. It started with timestamps. They overlaid dispatch assignment, unit status, radio transmissions, and the exact window of the stop. The number that kept coming back was 14 minutes. Not a momentary check, but long enough to change what late means in trauma care. Maya and Andre's statements were tight and consistent. Active trauma dispatch. Proof presented immediately. Supervisor requested through dispatch. Release delayed anyway. Captain Mallory's documentation focused on the gap. ALS was missing when it mattered, and included the detail that one victim had shown faint signs when fire arrived before advanced care ever touched them. Sergeant Dana Holloway's involvement made the failure even clearer. She instructed Mercer to clear the ambulance and verify by radio, not roadside. That created the core problem Mercer couldn't outrun. The entire stop could have been verified in seconds. One call to dispatch, one quick confirmation. Instead, he ran the stop like a normal enforcement scenario, ran IDs, found nothing, and still chose to write a citation while an active trauma call stayed pending. The case turned on one question that kept getting asked in different rooms by different people. Why didn't he verify by dispatch immediately? Because once that's asked, everything else becomes secondary. You can argue about traffic laws all day, but you can't justify refusing the fastest verification method available when the consequences are measured in survival windows. By the time depositions began, Mercer's explanation narrowed into a weak defense. He believed rules applied equally, and he was enforcing the law. The attorneys didn't fight him on philosophy. They pinned him to operational reality. They forced the comparison between what he could have done, radio verification and release, and what he did do, roadside detention and a ticket. And then they landed the question that ended the debate, whether his principle outweighed medical protocol when lives were on the line. After that, consequences weren't optional. They were unavoidable. Mercer was suspended and fined. The department moved to separate from him, and he resigned before he could be formally terminated because the footage made him radioactive for any agency that might consider hiring him. In law enforcement, that kind of documented, high-profile failure doesn't fade. It follows you. Civil lawsuits followed the same logic as the investigation. Preventable delay, documented deviation from protocol, fatal outcome. The city settled wrongful death claims for a combined amount around $4 million. Not because money fixes anything, but because the city couldn't argue the timeline away. And the last consequence was the one departments only make when they know the public saw the truth. Policy change. Clearwater updated procedures so that if an officer ever stops an emergency vehicle, the officer must contact dispatch immediately and must have supervisor authorization to continue holding that vehicle. In other words, no more roadside ego games with a trauma call on the clock. That's the part people don't like admitting. This didn't require a new invention or special training. It required one basic step that was available the entire time. Verify fast, then clear the ambulance. In the end, Mercer couldn't hide behind rules or rules. The footage and timestamps showed the ambulance could have been verified in seconds, but he chose to hold them anyway, and kept holding them even after a supervisor told him to clear it. He was suspended, fined, and resigned. And that kind of documented failure made him effectively unhireable in law enforcement. The city settled the wrongful death cases for about $4 million. And Clearwater updated policy so any officer stopping an emergency vehicle must verify with dispatch immediately and need supervisor authorization to keep that vehicle stopped. Now tell me, was that justice or paperwork pretending to be accountability? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and like and subscribe for more stories where the truth gets recorded and consequences actually follow.
Sir, you need to talk to me. Hand me your ID, now.
What's this about?
You're not detained, but you're not walking off. Show your ID.
If I'm not detained, the ID demand isn't a command. So which is it?
That folder, HIPAA violation. That's a felony.
This folder isn't a random patient's file. It's mine. And I'm internal
Turn
affairs.
that camera off.
This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Quick thing, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. What city or state? And if you like stories where power gets checked by facts, cameras, and calm boundaries, hit like and subscribe. Now back to it. Detective John Hale didn't look like he was there to cause trouble. He looked like a man trying to finish something and leave. Hands visible, shoulders steady, one palm resting on the folder like it was an anchor. Officer Miller acted like he'd been invited to take over the room. His voice carried on purpose. He told John he needed to talk for a second, loud enough that people waiting for blood work and discharge papers turned their heads. Behind the counter, Evan Ross, the receptionist, went pale in real time. He'd called for help, but he hadn't expected the temperature to jump this fast. John stayed calm. He asked what this was about. Officer Miller said Evan had reported John for harassing patients and trying to take a file without authorization. He stepped closer as he said it, closing distance, not to hear better, but to control the space. John didn't flinch. He pushed back on the accusation without raising his voice. He asked whose file Officer Miller thought it was. That should have slowed everything down. It didn't. Officer Miller demanded identification and labeled it a felony like the word itself did the work. His hand drifted toward his belt, not drawing anything, just making sure the lobby remembered he had the uniform and the tools. John responded with one clean question. Was he being detained? Officer Miller hesitated and tried to live in the middle. He said John wasn't being detained, but John cut him off. Still even, if he wasn't being detained, then the ID demand wasn't a command. So which was it? That's when the room sharpened. Not louder, just more aware. Because everyone had seen this before, "You're free to go," said with the body language of "try it." Officer Miller ignored the detention question and went back to the folder. He said John had taken a patient file without authorization. John tapped the folder lightly and corrected the premise. He said he wasn't taking a patient's file. He said he was handling official business. Officer Miller repeated official business with a tone that turned it into a joke. Then he said the quiet part out loud. John didn't look official. That line landed harder than the officer realized. It wasn't about policy. It was about perception. Evan Ross tried to intervene, clearly panicking now. He explained he only called because John had been asking questions and people got uncomfortable. And there it was. Not a crime. Not a clear threat. Discomfort. John didn't attack Evan. He named the problem. This was being built on vibes. Someone didn't like his tone at the counter, and suddenly the word harassment was being thrown around like it was a fact. Officer Miller didn't like hearing it framed that way. He told John not to get cute, and his eyes flicked to John's phone. John had been recording, not theatrically, not shoved in anyone's face, just held steady, angled down, capturing the interaction in a public lobby already covered by security cameras. Officer Miller pressured him about recording like the phone was the real offense. He ordered John to put it down. John refused, calmly, firmly. He framed it as documentation of a public interaction. Then he tightened the boundary again, If Officer Miller believed there was a crime, he needed to articulate it. If he was detaining John, he needed to say it. Otherwise, he needed to step back. That's when Officer Miller reached for a scary word he thought would force compliance. He pointed at the folder and declared it a HIPAA violation. John corrected the pronunciation without being dramatic. Then he pointed out the obvious. Officer Miller didn't even know what was in the folder. Officer Miller insisted he knew enough. In his mind, the mere act of holding the folder made it illegal. He kept repeating felony like it was a warning siren. This was the chess game right here. Officer Miller leaning on volume and vague legal threats. John refusing to give him anything he didn't have the authority to take. A charge nurse, Lila Nguyen, passed through the edge of the scene, slowed for half a second, and took in the details the way medical staff learn to. The tone, the distance, the phone recording, the fact that John's posture didn't match the story being told about him. John asked again, without spiraling into a lecture, whether this was detention or a voluntary conversation. Officer Miller still wouldn't answer cleanly. He kept pressing. He kept crowding. He kept treating Evan's discomfort like probable cause. And Evan Ross stood there watching his own decision turn into something bigger, realizing too late he hadn't reported a crime. He'd reported a feeling. John took a breath like he'd reached the end of patience, not anger. Something colder. Like someone who'd already decided how much time he was willing to waste. He told Officer Miller carefully that the best thing he could do right now was walk away. Officer Miller scoffed and pushed back, like he needed to win in front of the room. John paused. For the first time, the lobby saw something under the calm. Something heavy, like John was carrying a bigger situation than this argument. Then John moved his hand toward the hem of his shirt. Not fast, not aggressive. Just enough movement to trigger the part of Officer Miller's brain trained to react to hands near clothing. Officer Miller's stance shifted immediately. His voice dropped without him meaning to. In the lobby, patients, families, staff went quiet in that specific way public spaces did when they sensed an incident crossing from uncomfortable into dangerous. John lifted the edge of his shirt slightly. What he showed wasn't a weapon. It was an injury, bandaging and bruising near his side, fresh enough that it didn't look like an old story. Officer Miller stared at it, visibly recalculating. Evan Ross looked like someone realizing he'd called the police on the wrong person at the worst possible moment. Because whatever happened to John Hale, it didn't match harassing patients. It matched a different kind of work entirely. The moment Detective John Hale showed the bandage at his side, the confrontation stopped being a front desk complaint and started feeling like something the lobby wasn't supposed to be part of. Officer Grant Miller's posture changed first. The volume dropped. The confidence shifted into calculation, like he'd realized he might have walked into the wrong kind of situation. Hale didn't try to win the room. He didn't dramatize it. He simply stated that he'd been shot a few nights earlier during undercover work. No details, no war story. Just a fact that didn't match the story Evan Ross had called in. Miller's eyes went back to the folder, still trying to anchor the situation to something simple. Rules, paperwork, privacy. He kept circling the same accusation. Unauthorized file, hospital policy, serious charges. Hale corrected the assumption without raising his voice. He made it clear the folder wasn't a random patient's information. It was his. That single detail hit the lobby like a hard reset. Evan Ross looked like he understood in real time that he hadn't reported a crime. He'd escalated discomfort into a police intervention, and now it was attached to the wrong person. Hale then revealed the bigger issue in plain terms. He worked internal affairs, and he was there because there were signs someone inside the hospital was leaking sensitive law enforcement information. Not gossip, not paranoia. A real concern that had already caused damage. And suddenly, everything Officer Miller had been doing, demanding ID loudly, threatening charges, arguing in public, trying to control recording, looked worse. Not just rude, risky. Because if Hale was telling the truth, then the danger in that building wasn't a man with a folder. It was someone who benefited from attention being pointed in the wrong direction. Hale kept his phone recording, steady and quiet. He didn't wave it around. He didn't threaten to post anything. He just let the documentation exist, the way someone did when they knew how quickly people rewrote the story later. Miller asked how he was supposed to confirm any of this. Hale gave him a controlled answer. Confirmation could happen through proper channels, but not out loud in the middle of a hospital lobby, not in front of patients and staff, and not in a way that alerted whoever might be listening. That was when Miller finally stepped out of the command voice and into something closer to professionalism. He backed off. He acknowledged he didn't have the full picture. He apologized, not as a performance, but as a correction. Evan Ross tried to speak, but he was visibly shaken. He kept glancing between the uniform and the man he'd labeled suspicious, like he couldn't figure out how the situation had flipped so completely. A nurse drifting near the edge of the scene noticed the shift, too. The staff didn't need the full story to sense it. This wasn't a routine complaint anymore. This was law enforcement business that didn't belong in public conversation. Hale didn't punish the receptionist with words. He didn't comfort him either. He stayed on task. He returned to the counter and pushed the process forward, like this interruption was just another obstacle he'd anticipated. Miller, now aware of the cameras and the phone and the crowd, repositioned himself. He stopped hovering over Hale and started acting like a barrier against further chaos, keeping the space calm, lowering the temperature, making it easier for Hale to finish without more noise. The lobby's attention slowly scattered again, but the tension didn't disappear. It just moved under the surface. Because Hale hadn't come there to argue with a patrol officer. He'd come there to see who inside that building reacted the wrong way when he asked for his own file. And now, thanks to the disruption, whoever was leaking information, if Hale was right, had been given a warning that something was happening. Hale kept his focus on procedure, timing, and control. He didn't rush. He didn't get sloppy. He just kept moving. Because the real test wasn't whether he could win a lobby argument. It was whether the hospital would make a mistake. After Officer Grant Miller backed off, the lobby slowly went back to normal. People looked away and returned to their phones. The receptionist, Evan Ross, kept working, but he looked tense. Detective John Hale stayed calm and stayed on the task. He wasn't there to argue. He was there to see how the hospital handled a records request under pressure. He kept his phone recording quietly. He didn't announce it. He didn't point it at anyone's face. He just kept a clean timeline. Hale continued the request using the normal process. He filled out what they required. He followed the steps. He didn't ask for special treatment. That mattered because he wanted the hospital's response to be defensible and trackable. Evan Ross said he needed to involve a supervisor. He framed it as policy. Hale didn't fight that. A supervisor meant more names involved, more cameras, more system log entries. A supervisor came out and spoke in a calm, professional way. Hale kept his explanation general. He said he was requesting his own record and needed the standard process completed. He did not explain why he wanted it. He did not mention internal affairs again. He did not give extra details. Hale watched how staff responded to a simple request. Some staff acted normal and moved on. Others lingered near the records area longer than they needed to. One staff member stopped nearby without an obvious reason. Another walked past twice. None of that proved anything by itself, but Hale noted the timing. Evan Ross checked his phone under the counter. It was quick. Hale didn't accuse him of anything. People texted at work, but the timing stood out because it happened right after a police officer had confronted Hale in the lobby. The supervisor returned to the computer and said they needed a moment to confirm something in the system. Again, that could be routine. Hale stayed quiet and let them work, but he watched for unnecessary delays. Then a call came into the front desk. Evan answered. His face changed. He glanced at Hale, then at the supervisor, then away. The call ended quickly. Hale didn't ask who it was. He didn't demand to see the phone. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said he needed the process completed without further delays. That statement did two things. It kept the interaction calm in public. It created a clear point on the recording where Hale requested the standard process to continue. The supervisor pushed the request forward. A few minutes later, Hale received what he came for through the official process. Hale checked the paperwork for names and timestamps. His phone recording captured the handoff. Officer Miller stayed back and didn't interfere again. He looked uncomfortable, but he kept the area quiet, which helped. Hale left without rushing. Outside the lobby, he focused on what mattered. The staff reactions, the phone activity he saw, the unexpected call, and the exact times. Those details were what internal affairs could compare to access logs and camera footage later. Once the hospital access logs came back, John Hale's case stopped being about a heated lobby interaction and became what it should have been from the start, a traceable sequence of actions tied to specific accounts, terminals, and times. The hospital system showed the normal steps for a standard record request. It also showed one action that didn't fit. During the same window when the front desk had taken an unexpected call and the receptionist's demeanor shifted, a user account opened sections of Hale's chart that weren't necessary to process a routine release. It wasn't a harmless click. It was a deeper look than procedure required. Internal affairs didn't jump to conclusions. They did what they always did. They compared it against patterns. They pulled the last few weeks of access history, tied to the same workstation and the same user credentials, then compared those timestamps to other incidents where undercover details had surfaced too early. They looked for the simplest explanation first: training issue, curiosity, or sloppy procedure. But the timing wasn't random. It clustered around moments when police-related patients came through the hospital, and it clustered around moments when staff had no legitimate reason to dig deeper. They interviewed the staff member tied to the access. The employee tried to explain it as routine verification. They said they were following policy, that the system sometimes required extra steps, that they were just making sure the release was correct. IA didn't argue. They took the statement, thanked them, and moved on. Then they pulled the hospital's written policy and matched it line by line against what the employee claimed. The routine verification explanation didn't match what the policy required. The policy didn't require opening those sections. The policy didn't require that level of access. IA now had a gap between the story and the system. At that point, the hospital's compliance department got involved. They had their own reasons to treat this seriously. A staff member accessing records without a proper purpose wasn't just a rumor problem. It was a regulatory problem. It exposed the hospital to real liability. Internal Affairs made it clear that they weren't there to punish normal staff who were caught in the middle of a tense day. They were there to identify whether sensitive law enforcement information was being exposed. They requested the front desk phone logs for the exact time window when the call came in and changed how the receptionist behaved. The hospital provided the incoming number information for the desk line. The incoming call didn't come from a patient family member or another department. It came from an outside number that didn't belong in the hospital workflow. IA then did the next step the proper way. They obtained legal authority to connect the dots outside the hospital. They didn't seize phones without cause. They didn't do hallway interrogations. They used the process that held up in court. When the phone number was run through the right channels, it linked to a person already flagged in a separate gang intelligence file. Not the top of a crew, but someone known for coordinating information and passing messages. Someone who benefited from advance notice when law enforcement activity was near. That's when the hospital leak stopped being a theory. Internal Affairs went back to the staff member tied to the unusual access and brought them in again, this time with a clearer timeline. They didn't threaten, they didn't raise their voices, they presented the verified facts, the exact access timestamps, the exact sections opened, the exact call time to the front desk, and the exact time the staff member's account took the unusual action. The staff member denied intent again, but the denial got thinner. They claimed they never contacted anyone. They claimed they didn't message anyone. They claimed they didn't even know why a gang-related number would be calling the desk line. IA didn't debate it. They followed the trail. They pulled additional camera footage. Not just the lobby-wide view, but angles that showed the desk area, hand movements, and whether a personal phone was in use. It wasn't perfect, but it showed enough to contradict the clean version of events. It showed a quick look down and a brief thumb movement consistent with a message being typed. At the same time, Iowa checked whether the hospital system flagged break glass access. Many systems logged when staff opened protected records without standard need. The hospital system showed those protected accesses were happening more than once, and not only for Hale. That created the next step, a controlled test. Internal Affairs coordinated with the hospital and set a monitored scenario that looked routine on the surface. It didn't involve fake emergencies or complicated setups. It involved a record that would only be accessed by someone who was looking for it, not processing it. They monitored which accounts touched it, which screens were opened, and whether any outside call or message followed. The same account touched it. The same pattern followed. And within minutes, a phone number linked to the same gang contact received a message from a device connected to the employee's personal line. That was enough. At that stage, the case moved out of internal review and into criminal exposure. Internal Affairs brought the district attorney's office into the loop and presented the evidence package: hospital access logs, policy comparisons, camera footage, phone records obtained through proper process, and the controlled test results. The DA's office didn't need a dramatic confession. They needed a story supported by records. Now, the original reason John Hale had come to the hospital clicked into place. He wasn't there because he wanted special treatment. He was there because he needed to see who would react the wrong way when his name entered the system. The lobby confrontation had been an interference, but it hadn't stopped the trap from working. It just made the time window more obvious. As the hospital leak case progressed, Iowa also looped back to the undercover operation that got Hale shot. They reviewed how his identity had been exposed and whether the hospital leak had contributed directly. They didn't claim what they couldn't prove, but they showed that sensitive information had been moving from the medical side to street contacts, and that movement created a serious risk to any officer whose name appeared in those records. The gang contact tied to the phone number was arrested as well. Charges depended on what the DA could prove: conspiracy, obstruction, and any related offenses tied to violence or intimidation. IA didn't promise the maximum penalty in public. They focused on securing convictions that would stick. Officer Grant Miller's part of the story didn't disappear either. His department reviewed his conduct in the lobby based on dispatch audio, camera footage, and Hale's phone recording. The review wasn't about embarrassing him. It was about whether he had used legal language accurately and whether he had escalated based on assumptions. The conclusion was straightforward. He had treated a voluntary encounter like it wasn't voluntary, threatened felony consequences without confirming key facts, and tried to stop recording without proper cause. He wasn't charged with a crime, but he didn't walk away untouched. He received formal counseling and corrective training. His supervisor documented the incident and required him to complete training on detentions versus consensual contact, public recording rights, and how to handle medical privacy claims without inventing criminal authority. The department also updated its guidance for responding to hospital calls, so officers didn't keep using HIPAA like a threat when what they really meant was, the hospital has a policy. Miller also personally apologized to Hale again later, away from the lobby. Not because an apology fixed everything, but because it mattered to acknowledge what he had done. He had put pressure on the wrong person and helped create a public disturbance in a sensitive environment. Hale didn't accept or reject it dramatically. He treated it like a professional correction and moved forward. For Hale, the outcome wasn't satisfying, in the way viral clips make things look satisfying. He still had a healing wound. He still had a case that involved real risk. But he got something that mattered more than a moment of dominance. The leak path was identified, documented, and shut down through a process that could hold up. There were ripple effects beyond the arrests and terminations. The hospital changed how it trained front desk staff and supervisors. Calling police became a last resort tied to specific behaviors, not discomfort. Staff were coached to distinguish between someone being firm and someone being threatening. They added better escalation options that didn't involve handing the situation to a uniform who might escalate it further. The records department tightened permissions, expanded audit alerts, and made it harder for any single staff member to explore chart sections without a documented need. On the law enforcement side, the department's training emphasized something basic but often ignored. Authority didn't replace accuracy. Officers were reminded that if they couldn't articulate a legal basis, they couldn't force compliance by volume. They were also reminded that hospitals were public-facing spaces full of vulnerable people, and unnecessary escalation there did more harm than good. The last piece of the story was quieter. A few weeks later, Hale returned to the hospital for a follow-up appointment like any other patient. This time, there was no scene, no shouting, no crowd watching. Just a man walking through a lobby that had learned the hard way what happens when assumptions get treated like facts. And if you think about it, that was the real lesson. The most dangerous situations weren't always the ones that looked dangerous at first. Sometimes the danger started with someone saying they just wanted to be safe, then using that feeling to justify control over someone they didn't understand. That's how bias becomes policy. That's how policy becomes pressure. And that pressure in the wrong moment can ruin lives and compromise real investigations. So here's the question for you. If you were standing in that lobby and you saw an officer demanding ID without a clear detention, and you saw a calm person recording and holding boundaries, what would you have assumed was happening? Would you have trusted the uniform automatically? Or would you have waited for facts? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you've ever seen rules used as a weapon against someone who didn't fit the image people expected, share your experience too. And make sure you subscribe for more story times where calm, documentation, and accountability are what finally win.
I need both of your IDs right now.
Are we being detained? What crime are you investigating?
A report came in. Just give me your IDs.
A report of what exactly? And what law says we have to identify without reasonable suspicion?
You're making this difficult. Don't play games.
We're not playing games. We're asking if this is...
This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. A patrol officer named Suarez stood at the edge of a breakfast booth, shoulders squared like he'd already decided what kind of day this was going to be. Two men sat with plates half finished, napkins pushed aside, and a small spread of papers and markers between them. The men stayed seated, calm, still eating, still refusing to give up control of the moment. Suarez kept pressing for identification. He framed it like a simple request, but he repeated it like a command. The men didn't match his energy, they didn't raise their voices, they didn't reach for pockets, they didn't scramble to prove innocence. They did the opposite. They asked again and again what crime they were suspected of and whether they were being detained. Suarez didn't answer those questions in a way that cleared anything up. He kept circling back to the same idea. If nothing was wrong, showing ID would make it easy. The men didn't take the bait. They kept pushing the legal line back into the center of the conversation. No crime, no reasonable suspicion, no detention, no ID. And around them, the restaurant went quiet in that specific way it did when strangers decided they were watching a situation instead of eating breakfast. Now, before this goes any further, tell everyone where you're watching from. country, state, city, anything. And if you watch stories about power getting checked by facts, boundaries, and accountability, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because what happened next wasn't luck. It was the kind of thing that only happens when someone stays calm, stays precise, and the right eyes show up at the right time. The two men at the booth were Malik Grant and Evan Cole. On the surface, they looked like two guys doing paperwork over breakfast. Hoodies, casual jackets, nothing flashy, no cop look, no visible gear. But they weren't civilians. They were undercover detectives running an operation, and the papers and markers weren't random. They were planning, tracking, timing. The kind of work that lived on notes, maps, schedules, and quick corrections written in bold colors, so nothing got missed. It was mid-morning at a family restaurant that catered to regulars. The atmosphere was predictable. Coffee refills, local gossip, plates sliding across counters, people who felt like they owned the space because they'd been there 100 times. Malik and Evan didn't fit in the way some people measured belonging. They weren't loud, they weren't causing a scene, but they were focused, working and talking about banks in a way that wasn't casual. That was all it took. A waitress named Tessa noticed them early. Not because they were disruptive, because they had papers spread out and they weren't talking softly. She overheard the word banks more than once. She saw a marker in someone's hand. She saw them pointing at something on the table. And instead of asking what they needed or treating it like normal business meeting behavior, she treated it like a threat. She didn't frame it as two customers doing paperwork. She framed it as fear. She reported that other customers were worried, that the men seemed like they were planning something. She used the words that would make someone respond fast. When the call reached patrol, it didn't come in as, "They're loud." It came in as suspicious talk about banks. It came in as the kind of vague warning that carried a lot of implication, but almost no facts. Suarez arrived ready to be the guy who stopped something before it happened. The problem was, he didn't walk in ready to observe. He walked in ready to confirm. He scanned the room and locked onto the booth. He didn't start by asking staff what they actually saw. He didn't separate rumor from detail. He went straight to Malik and Evan like they were already halfway guilty, and he just needed the paperwork to complete the story. He approached with the posture of authority that wasn't technically a detention yet, but was designed to feel like one. He positioned himself so leaving would mean brushing past him. He stood close enough that the booth didn't feel private anymore. Malik looked up first, and he didn't move fast. He didn't act surprised. He acted like a man who'd spent years handling unpredictable moments without giving them extra oxygen. Evan stayed quiet at first, eyes on Suarez, reading him, not emotional, not aggressive, just assessing. Suarez started with questions that sounded casual on paper. What were they working on? Why so many papers? What did they mean by banks? Who were they? Then the questions narrowed toward identity. Suarez asked for IDs. Malik didn't comply. He didn't refuse in a dramatic way. He refused in a controlled way. He asked what crime was being investigated. He asked what reasonable suspicions Suarez had. He asked whether they were being detained or free to go. That's where the power game started to show. Suarez didn't give a clear detention. He also didn't let it be a normal conversation. He tried to hold them in place without saying the words that would trigger legal standards. He tried to get what he wanted, names, information, control, without committing to an actual basis. Evan stepped in then, still calm, still seated, but more direct. He repeated the same questions Malik asked. What crime? What specific suspicious behavior? Were they detained? Suarez didn't answer cleanly. Instead, he pushed the familiar pressure line. If they weren't doing anything wrong, showing ID would be quick and easy. He treated their refusal like a sign of guilt. He treated compliance like the price of peace. Malik and Evan didn't argue feelings. They argued process. They pointed out that a waitress's vague fear wasn't a crime. They pointed out that talking about banks wasn't illegal. They pointed out that having papers and markers at a breakfast table didn't create reasonable suspicion. And then they did something that made Suarez visibly more irritated. They suggested he go talk to the waitress and get actual facts instead of fishing for IDs from two people who were just sitting there. That suggestion hit Suarez's ego because it exposed what he was doing. It wasn't an investigation. It was leverage. The room had shifted by then. A couple people at nearby tables were watching too hard. Someone near the counter had their phone angled in a way that didn't look like texting. The restaurant's ceiling cameras were pointed down across the booths, silent and unblinking. Suarez kept standing there, and the longer he stayed, the more it looked like what it was. One officer trying to turn discomfort into authority. Malik and Evan held the line. No escalation, no sudden moves, no yelling. Just consistent questions and consistent refusal. And that's the part most people don't understand until they see it. Staying calm doesn't end pressure. Sometimes it increases it because it removes the excuse to call you the problem. Suarez tried a new angle. He leaned into the social script, the one that's worked for him before. The script where the officer plays reasonable and the citizen plays difficult. The script where the crowd assumes the officer must have a reason. But Malik and Evan didn't give him the performance. They kept it clinical. They kept it simple. They kept it on the record. And then, right when Suarez seemed ready to either double down or manufacture something more, the front door opened and a new person walked in. This person didn't scan the room like a customer looking for a seat. He looked like someone who noticed everything. Someone who belonged in the building in a way Suarez hadn't considered. He took 2 steps in and looked towards the booth and recognized Malik and Evan instantly. That recognition was the tiny detail that changed everything. The man who walked in was Mason Hale. Plain clothes, no uniform, but he carried himself like someone who'd worn one for a long time. He paused just long enough to take in the posture at the booth. Suarez standing over 2 seated men, the table covered in notes, the whole room watching. Hale didn't ask the hostess for a table. He didn't pretend this was none of his business. He walked straight toward them. Suarez noticed him late because Suarez was still locked into his own pressure routine. But Malik saw Hale immediately. Evan did too. Neither man looked relieved. They looked ready for the next move, whichever way it went. Hale reached the booth and gave Malik a quick nod that said he knew exactly who he was. Then he looked at Evan the same way. Recognition, familiarity, professional. Suarez's face changed before anyone said anything out loud. He didn't have to be told what it meant. He could see it. 2 men he'd been treating like suspects were being acknowledged like colleagues. Hale asked Suarez what the situation was. Suarez tried to summarize it in the safest language possible. He kept it vague, like the original complaint. Customers were concerned, talk about banks, papers on the table. He was just checking. Hale didn't accept the summary as justification. He asked what specific crime was being investigated and what specific behavior created reasonable suspicion. He asked whether Suarez had detained them or whether this was consensual. That's when the whole thing tightened. Because Malik and Evan had already asked those questions multiple times, and Suarez had avoided answering them. Now, the same questions were coming from someone Suarez couldn't dismiss. Suarez tried to pivot into the public safety explanation again, but Hale cut through it by forcing it back to standards, what facts, what suspicion, what legal basis. Malik finally ended the uncertainty without making it a show. He identified himself as a detective, still calm, still seated. Evan followed with the same. They did it the way experienced undercover guys did it. Short, controlled, not flashing anything around for the dining room. Hale confirmed it with his own reaction. He addressed them like detectives and asked briefly if they were good. In that moment, Suarez understood he had walked into a restaurant, trying to fish IDs from 2 people who knew the law better than he did and who could make the consequences real. The tone flipped so fast it was obvious to everyone watching. Suarez stepped back half a pace. His voice dropped. His posture softened. The same man who'd been leaning on, "If you're doing nothing wrong," now sounded like he was trying to rewind the last 5 minutes. Hale didn't let him. He told Suarez, clearly and without yelling, that a vague complaint about talking about banks and having papers wasn't reasonable suspicion. He pointed out that asking for ID without grounds was not a harmless habit. It was a constitutional problem and a community trust problem. He reminded Suarez that a consensual encounter stayed consensual only if people were actually free to refuse, and that hovering over a booth demanding ID looked like a detention, no matter how it was labeled. Hale also pointed out the mistakes Suarez had made from the start. He hadn't even gone back to the source to separate what was actually observed from what was assumed. He had treated a nervous story as evidence. Malik didn't pile on. He didn't gloat. He kept his face neutral and his voice level. He told Suarez the same thing he'd been saying all along. If there was no crime and no suspicion, there was no reason to demand identification. He kept it simple. He made it about the rule, not about Suarez as a person. Evan added one more point, still measured. Suarez's favorite line, "If you're doing nothing wrong," wasn't a legal standard. It was a pressure tactic. And it didn't become valid just because a badge said it. Suarez tried to recover by saying he was just following up because people were worried. Hale didn't argue that people could feel worried. He argued what police could do with worry. He drew the line between feelings and facts. And then Hale made it practical. He told Suarez that his body camera would show the entire exchange, including the repeated refusal to articulate suspicion, and that supervisors would not defend ID phishing if it became a complaint. That part mattered, because now it wasn't just Malik and Evan holding a boundary. It was oversight, documentation, a clear record, the thing that turned a street-level power play into a professional liability. Suarez finally backed off. He told Malik and Evan he hadn't known who they were. He apologized, but it wasn't the kind of apology that fixes what just happened. It was the kind of apology people give when they realize they pushed the wrong target. Hale didn't let Suarez leave without one final correction. He told him, quietly but firm, that the job wasn't to turn stereotypes into stops. The job was to observe, verify, and only escalate when facts supported it. Suarez nodded like he understood. Then he turned away from the booth and walked out. The restaurant noise came back in small pieces. Silverware, low voices, coffee being poured. Like everyone had been holding their breath and didn't realize it until it ended. Malik and Evan didn't celebrate. They didn't even look around to see who had been watching. They gathered their papers, stacked the markers, and kept their focus on what they'd come there to do. Because for them, that booth wasn't just a breakfast table. It was a reminder of how fast a normal morning could get dangerous when someone in authority decided a story sounded exciting enough to chase. In the hours after Suarez left, the moment didn't stay in that booth. The restaurant had ceiling cameras. Suarez had a body cam. And at least one customer had recorded a short clip showing the basic shape of it. An officer pressing two calm men for ID without clearly naming a crime, then shifting fast when a plainclothes supervisor arrived. By the end of the day, it was circulating locally. Some people defended Suarez as being cautious. Others pointed out that caution still had legal limits, and vague fear wasn't reasonable suspicion. Inside the department, Hale treated it like a policy problem, not internet drama. He pulled Suarez in and walked through the exact failures. He hadn't verified what the waitress actually observed. He couldn't articulate a specific crime, and he tried to turn a voluntary contact into compliance by leaning on pressure language instead of facts. Hale made one point stick. This wasn't only wrong because the men were detectives. It would have been wrong with any customers. The restaurant got contacted too. Management addressed the staff process for calling police because customers feel weird wasn't a reportable crime. The waitress admitted she hadn't heard a plan or seen anything illegal. She heard the word banks, saw papers and markers, and filled in the rest. She was given corrective guidance and, a formal warning about escalating assumptions. Suarez didn't get a dramatic punishment. What he got was real-world accountability, a documented counseling entry, and mandatory refresher training focused on consensual encounters, detention standards, and ID requests. The kind of correction that follows an officer and becomes a bigger issue if it happens again. Malik and Evan didn't chase attention. They kept running their operation, and they made a practical change. They stopped using that restaurant for planning. Undercover work depended on staying ordinary, and the place had already shown it could turn ordinary into suspicious with one bad assumption. Weeks later, their paper and marker planning proved what it always was: actual police work. The patterns they'd mapped led to a clean stop tied to the activity they were tracking around financial locations. No headlines, just a solid case, the kind that protected people quietly. And that's where the full lesson landed. The most important thing wasn't that Suarez accidentally pressured undercover detectives. The important thing was how easily a vague complaint almost became a detention without legal grounds, and how fast the tone changed only when oversight entered the room. That's what accountability looks like in real life. Cameras, standards, supervisors who don't excuse shortcuts, and people who know how to calmly demand the legal basis before they give up their identity. So here's the question for you. If you were in that booth and an officer kept pushing for ID without naming a crime, would you have known what to ask, and would you have stayed calm enough to hold the line? Drop your thoughts in the comments, share this with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe if you want more story times where dignity and facts beat pressure.
Give me your identification.
What's this about? I'm just parked here waiting for my wife.
You look suspicious. That's all I need.
My phone is ringing. I'm going to answer.
Make it quick.
This is Darnell Carter.
Yes.
Executive Director, Police Accountability Commission.
All right, listen. This is the kind of parking lot encounter that makes people say, that can't be real, until you remember how fast a normal day can turn into a controlled situation when someone with a badge decides they're in charge of the story. The officer had Darnell Carter boxed in so tight with the patrol SUV that Darnell couldn't back out even if he wanted to. The officer stood at the driver's side window, posture stiff, one hand hovering near his belt, and kept pressing for identification while treating the whole thing like Darnell had done something wrong just by sitting there. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Before we jump in, tell us where you're watching from. What city and state? And if you watch these stories because you care about dignity, accountability, and people not getting pushed around just because someone has power, hit like and subscribe. Now, rewind. It was a normal day at a shopping plaza in Cedar Rapids. Late afternoon, busy parking lanes, people coming and going with bags, carts, kids. Darnell wasn't speeding through town. He wasn't causing a scene. He was parked. He was waiting on his wife, and he was doing what a lot of people do when they're killing time, reading through papers in the car, the kind of quiet moment that's supposed to be nothing. Engine off, seatbelt off, papers in his lap, phone nearby, no music blasting, no one yelling, just waiting. Darnell was black, mid-career, clean-cut, the kind of guy who stayed organized. He was used to being careful in public spaces, not because he was doing anything wrong, but because he understood something a lot of people learn the hard way. The same harmless behavior can get read differently depending on who's doing it. He had been parked long enough to finish a few pages when he noticed the patrol vehicle. It didn't glide past like routine traffic. It slowed, it angled. It turned into the lane like it had picked him out. And then it did something that changed the whole situation. The patrol SUV pulled in behind Darnell's car, close, too close. Not a normal parking behind someone close, more like a deliberate block. Then, to make it worse, the officer angled the SUV in a way that left Darnell's front end boxed by another parked vehicle, and his rear pinned by the patrol unit. That's not a casual contact. That's a detention move. Darnell sat still. He didn't start the car. He didn't reach around. He didn't jump out. He waited, hands visible, papers lowered. He watched the officer in the side mirror and the rear view, tracking every step. The officer approached with a certain energy, like the decision had already been made that something was wrong, and now the officer just needed Darnell to fit the story. The officer stood by the window and demanded identification. Darnell didn't argue right away. He asked what this was about, because he was literally sitting in a parked car in a public lot, waiting for his wife. He wanted to know the reason. The officer responded like reasons were optional. He claimed he didn't need one. He said Darnell looked suspicious. He talked in that vague way that can mean anything and nothing at the same time. Then it got worse. The officer used "people like you" language. Not a direct accusation of a specific crime. Not a clear concern like, someone reported a burglary or we're looking for a suspect. It was the kind of phrase that tries to sound like officer safety but lands as profiling. The kind of phrase that tells a person, without saying it outright, that the officer had already sorted them into a category. Darnell stayed measured. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't do the things some people expect. He didn't perform calm in a desperate way. He was just calm. He asked again what the suspicion was based on. The officer didn't answer with facts. He answered with control. He told Darnell to step out of the car. That command changed the stakes immediately, because it wasn't just about ID anymore. Now it was about compliance under pressure. Darnell took a breath. He moved slowly. He made it obvious he wasn't trying to surprise anyone. He told the officer he was reaching for his wallet because his ID was in it. That should have reduced tension. That's what people are told to do. Announce your movements, keep it visible, move slow. But the officer reacted like Darnell had done something aggressive. The officer's posture tightened. The officer's voice got sharper. The officer treated that reach toward the center console like it was a threat, like Darnell had reached for something else. And this is where the power chest starts showing. Because once an officer frames a normal movement as suspicious, the person on the other side is suddenly defending against an accusation that isn't based on anything real. Darnell had to manage his body, his tone, his hands, his wording, while the officer got to escalate on vibes. The officer ordered him to stop moving. Darnell froze exactly where he was, wallet still not even fully in hand. He made his hands visible again. He waited for instructions like his safety depended on it, because it did. The officer then had him step out and immediately put hands on him. Not a casual pat-down. A frisk. The officer ran through the motions like it was justified by suspicious behavior, even though the only behavior was sitting in a parked car and reaching for a wallet after being told to provide ID. Darnell didn't resist. He didn't argue during the frisk. He let it happen, because he knew how quickly a minor disagreement turns into a bigger story when the person with the badge decides it will. After the frisk, the officer took the ID and ran Darnell's information. And that's where this should have ended, because it came back clean. No warrants, no criminal history, nothing that matched the officer's implied narrative. In a normal world, the officer would hand the ID back, maybe give a short explanation and leave. But the officer didn't leave. Instead, the officer stayed right there, keeping Darnell standing outside his own car, continuing to question him like he was still trying to catch him in something. The questions weren't about a specific crime. They were fishing questions, the kind that keep a person trapped in a conversation where every answer can be twisted. Darnell answered without giving extra. He kept it short and clear. He was waiting for his wife, he was reading papers, and he wasn't doing anything illegal. The officer responded with dismissive comments, not overt slurs, not something that would be easy to summarize as one bad phrase, more like a constant drip of disrespect, tone, sarcasm, and the implication that Darnell's explanation wasn't good enough, even though it was completely normal. The detention stretched. People walked past. Some glanced. Some looked away fast. That's how these things often happen. Public enough for witnesses, but private enough that everyone feels like it's not their business. But at least one person noticed the pattern. A man being kept outside his vehicle, searched, cleared, and still treated like a problem. Darnell noticed that too. He saw the passersby. He saw the momentary eye contact. He didn't try to recruit help. He didn't wave anyone over. He stayed focused on one goal: getting out of this without giving the officer an excuse to escalate. Then his phone rang. And it wasn't just a random call. It was the kind of call that mattered enough that ignoring it felt risky. But answering it under this kind of scrutiny also carried risk, because now the officer could use it as another excuse to control the situation. Darnell looked at the officer, signaled what was happening, and made it clear he was about to answer. The officer hesitated, like he wanted to say no. And right there, right before Darnell hit accept, was the moment the entire stop balanced on a thin line. Because the next thing Darnell revealed would change the officer's tone so fast, it would feel like someone flipped a switch. Darnell's phone rang while he was still standing outside his car, still technically detained, still being treated like he owed the officer an explanation for existing in a parking lot. He didn't snap for his phone. He didn't rush. He kept his hands where the officer could see them and made a small, controlled motion to indicate what was happening. He made it clear he was about to answer a call. The officer didn't like it. His body language shifted like he was deciding whether to block it. He couldn't quite justify it out loud, though, because the situation was already thin. No crime, no warrants, no reason that held up. Darnell answered anyway, and he kept it brief. He identified himself the way people do when the call matters and time matters. Then he said the title that changed the temperature in the air. He explained he was the executive director of the city's Police Accountability Commission. The change in the officer was immediate. A second earlier, the officer had been dismissive, controlling, casual about authority. Now he became careful. His posture loosened just enough to signal he was backtracking without saying it. His voice dropped into a more professional register. He stopped using vague, suspicious framing and shifted toward procedural language. Darnell ended the call and looked at the officer again. He didn't gloat. He didn't threaten. He didn't do the "do you know who I am" routine. He did something more effective. He went quiet and let the contrast speak for itself. Because the contrast was the proof. The officer had been comfortable treating him like a problem until it became clear Darnell had a role connected to oversight. Now the officer wanted to control the damage. The officer returned Darnell's ID. The officer started moving toward a soft exit, the kind officers use when they want an encounter to disappear. He acted like it had been a routine check. He acted like the delay had been normal. He tried to wrap it up as if the earlier language in the frisk and the fishing questions hadn't happened. But Darnell didn't let the officer rewrite what had just occurred. He stayed calm and precise. He asked again what the actual reason was for the stop and the frisk. He asked why he'd been boxed in. He asked why he'd been kept there after his record came back clean. The officer didn't give a real answer. He tried to keep it vague. He tried to suggest it was about suspicious behavior without naming any behavior that would hold up. Darnell kept his tone steady and didn't escalate. He just made it clear he was tracking every step. And while this exchange was happening, someone nearby was tracking it too. A witness, someone who had been walking toward the storefronts, had slowed down earlier when they saw the patrol SUV blocking the car. They noticed Darnell wasn't yelling. They noticed he wasn't acting reckless. They noticed he was being treated like a suspect anyway. The witness didn't intervene directly. They didn't try to argue with the officer. They did what people have learned to do in situations like this. They observed, they remembered details, and they prepared to report it. The officer, now aware the moment could have consequences, started rapping faster. He gave Darnell a final dismissive comment, lighter than before, but still meant to place the officer above accountability. The message was basically that Darnell should be grateful he was being checked, like the inconvenience and humiliation were normal costs of doing business. Darnell didn't argue. He didn't lecture. He just said one line that ended the encounter cleanly. He stated that being cleared didn't justify being treated like a suspect in the first place, and that he would be following up formally. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just made it clear this wasn't going to disappear. The officer walked back to his SUV and drove off. And just like that, the parking lot went back to normal on the surface. But Darnell didn't feel normal. His hands were steady, but his mind was already moving through the timeline like a checklist. The boxing in, the ID demand without reason, the people like you language, the escalation when he reached for his wallet, the frisk, the clean return, the extended detention anyway. Then the sudden tone shift after the title. Those details mattered because they revealed motive and pattern, not just one moment. A few minutes later, Darnell's wife, Maya, came out of a store with a small bag and the look of someone expecting a normal pickup. She saw his expression first. Then she saw the way he was standing, still in that controlled, post-incident posture people get when something has just happened and they're trying to keep it contained. Darnell told her, quickly, what happened. Not with drama, with facts. Maya looked around the lot like she was trying to picture it. She asked where the officer went. She asked if Darnell was okay. She asked if anyone saw it. That's when Darnell pointed out the witness nearby, someone who had lingered longer than a casual shopper would. The witness approached just enough to make it clear they weren't imagining things. They told Darnell they saw the stop and felt it was wrong. They said they were willing to file a complaint and provide a statement about what they observed. The boxing in, the frisk, the length of detention, the way the officer spoke. That witness statement became the second key piece. Because in these situations, it's not just about what happened. It's about what can be verified. Darnell didn't waste time. That same day, he documented everything while it was fresh. Times, location, patrol car position, the sequence of commands, the fact he was cleared and still detained, the tone shift after he identified his role. Then he did something most people don't have the access or energy to do. He started the accountability process immediately. A complaint was filed. The witness filed one too. And that mattered because it forced the incident into a formal track. It wasn't a private grievance anymore. It was an official record with multiple points of contact connected to a stop that should have ended the moment the officer saw there was nothing there. That complaint triggered a Bodycam review. And the Bodycam didn't just capture an officer doing a stop. It captured the pattern, vague suspicion, aggressive control, and the way the officer treated Darnell before and after learning who he was. Once the review started, the city couldn't pretend it was nothing. Darnell didn't posture publicly. He didn't run to social media first. He followed the system the way it was supposed to work. Because if the system was legitimate, it should hold even when the person complaining was just a regular resident. But this time, the person complaining wasn't just a resident. He was also someone whose job existed, because the city claimed it believed in accountability. And that made the next phase unavoidable. Within days, conversations started happening behind closed doors. Not because the city suddenly cared about Darnell's comfort, but because the city could see what the footage showed, and they could see how the officer's language and choices would look under a review. Darnell then did the next step. He filed a civil rights lawsuit, not as a threat, as a documented response. He alleged the stop and detention were unconstitutional, rooted in profiling, and extended without lawful justification. The clean record made the extended detention harder to defend. The witness statement made it harder to dismiss. The body cam made it harder to spin. And then the story started to spread. Not because Darnell wanted it to be viral, because people in the community recognized the pattern immediately. They had their own versions of it. Different parking lots, different officers, different excuses. Same vague suspicious label. Same I don't need a reason attitude, same imbalance. And once the city realized this case wasn't staying quiet, they had a choice. Fight it and risk everything being exposed in court, or settle and try to control the fallout. They chose to settle, but settling didn't end it, because the officer's conduct wasn't just a misunderstanding. The review didn't stop at the lawsuit. It moved into employment decisions, policy questions, and oversight demands. And that's where the biggest shift happened, because once the footage became public, the officer's behavior wasn't judged by internal culture anymore. It was judged by everyone. Once the complaint and the witness statement hit the system, the tone around the incident changed fast, because it was no longer just one person's word against an officer's. There was a time-stamped complaint. There was an independent witness, and there was Bodycam. The city initiated a formal review, and internally, that meant 2 tracks running at the same time, a legal track and a discipline track. On the legal side, the city's attorneys wanted to know one thing. Could they defend the officer's reason for boxing Darnell in and detaining him after the record check came back clean? On the discipline side, supervisors had to answer another question. Did the officer violate policy through the way he initiated the contact, escalated it, and prolonged it? Because from the outside, it looked simple. A man was parked, waiting for his wife, reading papers. The officer turned that into a stop without a clear reason, then kept it going even when there was nothing to support it. And that's the part people miss. The harm isn't only the frisk. It's the message that the person can be treated like a suspect without cause, and then held there until the officer decides to stop. The body cam footage became the center of everything. It showed the officer's initial approach and the setup. The patrol SUV placed behind Darnell's car in a way that trapped him. It showed the officer's repeated insistence on ID without explaining a specific complaint or alleged crime. It captured the suspicious framing without facts. And it captured the people like you phrasing that had no place in a professional stop. Most importantly, it captured the sequence that made it indefensible. Darnell did what the public is told to do. He moved slowly, announced he was reaching for his wallet, and kept his hands visible. The officer treated that as an escalation anyway. Then came the frisk. Then came the records check. Then came the clean return. And then, still no release. Instead of ending the encounter, the officer kept fishing. He kept Darnell outside the car, still under control, still being questioned, still being treated like an explanation wasn't enough. Then the call happened, and the footage caught the pivot. The moment Darnell identified his role as executive director of the Police Accountability Commission, the officer's demeanor changed. The officer didn't suddenly discover a new legal standard. He didn't suddenly remember policy. He just adjusted because the risk changed. That contrast wasn't subtle on video, and supervisors knew it. Attorneys knew it. Anyone who watched knew it. Darnell's lawsuit moved quickly because it was built on clear elements. The stop lacked a solid, articulable reason. The detention was prolonged after exculpatory information came back, and the officer's language suggested bias. The city tried the usual early moves, minimize, delay, and reframe it as routine. But there was a problem. Routine doesn't mean lawful. Routine doesn't mean acceptable. And routine definitely doesn't look like boxing a car in, frisking a compliant person, then dragging out questioning after a clean check. Behind the scenes, settlement discussions started earlier than most people would expect. Not because the city wanted to admit fault, because the city could see what discovery would do. Discovery would pull training records, prior complaints, internal messages, stop data and patterns. And once that door opens, it rarely stays contained to a single incident. So the city negotiated. The settlement wasn't framed as an apology on paper. Cities rarely do that. It was framed as resolution, risk management, closing the file. But there was still the employment decision. That part took longer because police discipline often moves slower and has more built-in resistance. Union processes, internal panels, appeals, and benefit of the doubt culture. Still, this case wasn't easy to protect. The footage wasn't a gray area. It showed the initial power move, the lack of clear justification, the escalation over a wallet reach, and the prolonged detention despite a clean check. It showed a tone shift linked to status, not safety. The department terminated the officer. The city didn't do it loudly at first. They did it through process. Termination notice, separation paperwork, a statement that stayed vague in public. But the story didn't stay quiet because the footage didn't stay private. Once public records requests and legal timelines moved forward, the video became accessible. And once it hit the internet, the public didn't watch it like an internal review board. They watched it like people who've seen this pattern before. The clip started spreading because it had the exact ingredients that make people stop scrolling. A calm black man in a parked car, an officer using authority without explanation, a stop that kept going for no reason, and then the immediate tone flip when the officer realized who he was dealing with. The virality wasn't about celebrity. It was about recognition. People shared it with captions that all sounded like the same point. This is what happens when the person doesn't have a title to protect them. Local reporters picked it up. Community meetings referenced it. People started calling in with similar stories. Some were recent, some were years old. But the pattern was consistent enough that it created pressure beyond Darnell's personal case. And pressure creates action, especially when it's tied to documentation. The policy conversation shifted from, "This was a misunderstanding," to "What safeguards failed here?" That's when the city was pushed into changes it had been slow walking for a long time. Mandatory body cams became less of a best practice and more of a hard requirement with enforcement. Not just wear it, but turn it on, with consequences for not recording. And the Police Accountability Commission's access changed too. Because the core issue wasn't just having footage. It was who could see it, how fast, and whether it could be delayed until public attention died down. The city revised oversight access rules, so independent review couldn't be stalled behind internal gatekeeping. And none of that happened because the city woke up with new morals. It happened because one stop was documented clearly enough that it couldn't be explained away. In the middle of all that, Darnell stayed consistent. He didn't become a loud public figure. He didn't treat the settlement like a victory lap. He treated it like proof. The city resolved the case because they knew what the video showed. And in private, when the noise died down, there was still the personal aftermath. Because being right doesn't erase what it feels like to be treated like a threat in a parking lot, while people walk past pretending they don't see it. Darnell went back to his work with the commission knowing something he already suspected, but now he had the clearest example possible. The difference between how you're treated and how you're supposed to be treated can come down to one thing: whether the system thinks you can fight back. And that's exactly why the ending mattered. Because this didn't just end with a settlement and a termination, it ended with a policy shift that made it harder for the next ridiculous stop to stay invisible. If you've ever been in a situation where someone tried to use power to make you feel small, drop in the comments what you would have done in Darnell's place. And if you want more real, grounded stories about accountability and people standing firm without losing control, make sure you subscribe.